In the past video, we talked about failure modes, and we actually made some progress completing our risk documentation. Among other things, our risk table was quite simple, but we already managed to create 2 risk table entries based on our very crappy risk analysis in our Google Sheet. So that's pretty cool. And now we have to fill up some remaining documentation gaps of stuff which we skipped for the sake of simplicity. And one of those things for today's video is actually risk controls. So the one obvious thing in our risk table right now is actually that this entry is actually not acceptable, and that is usually not something which you can hand in to your auditors, unfortunately, because it's quite obviously a red flag. They will kind of look at this and say hold on, you defined that this combination out of probability and severity is not acceptable, and then you documented that and you just handed it in. so that's a pretty crappy situation to be in. So we need to make this acceptable. So the first intuition, of course, would be yeah, we just changed the probability or severity, which I would not recommend. But just for the sake of this academic exercise, let's do that. So let's just assume, okay, let's just assume we had these probabilities of a hazard leading to a hazardous situation and hazardous situation leading to harm. Let's just assume these are way less likely, and then we save it, and then magically everything has become acceptable. And that's how you fix your risk table. No, seriously, this is just kind of to show you how it works in theory. But of course, now just randomly changing probabilities is probably not a great strategy to fix your risk analysis. So let's actually go back and undo that. So we had something like this. Oh, wait, maybe like that. Okay, save that. Okay, now it's not acceptable again, as you can see with the red banner at the bottom. And now we're screwed again. But the cool news is we are not done yet, and we still have options which are available to us. And that obvious option is risk control. So let's actually look at that right now. So if I go back to edit, or maybe just to recap the situation, is we have the situation of wrong medical text. So user is exposed to wrong medical text, they believe the wrong medical content, and then they have a worsening of depression, which is, let's say, not super bad. We define it as not super bad because we said it doesn't require medical intervention. And that's just for the sake of this example. Now, the problem, however, is that this severity category 2, based on this harm, and the probability category 1, that this combination is not acceptable because in our risk matrix, we defined this combination to not be acceptable, which also, again, makes sense. Now, what we can do is we can add a risk control. And what would a normal rational person do? Besides that, rational people don't create this much documentation, but what would a normal rational person do? They would likely kind of change something in this whole setup. So maybe, yes, we do have to display medical text in the app, but how can we prevent crappy medical text from being in our app? And the obvious answer to that is maybe we review our content before we place it in the app. And just like software developers do code review, you could have some sort of process for your content review, and probably actually that also makes a lot of sense actually. And how can we document that? So if you go back to this risk table entry, to the edit screen, you see all this stuff which we already documented, and now we have these things called risk controls, and a reduction factor and a severity category after the risk control, only if it's changed. So click to select the risk control. Oh damn, we don't have one, so we have to create one. Okay, so we have to create one. And how do we create one? You head over to the left side, risk controls. You see we don't have anyone right now. Let's create a new one. Select the type of risk control, probably protective. Actually, I would call this inherently safe design, actually. These are defined by the standards, and they're all kind of weird. Personally, I would give this the type of process. It's a process risk control, but let's just call it inherently safe design. That's how we roll. Okay, content review process. How do we describe this? Medical content is reviewed before being placed in the app. being reviewed by physicians or whatever. Like, let's keep it vague because that's the key to pragmatism, to keep things vague. All right. Optionally, you can link this to software requirements. In this case, I don't think it makes sense. You can optionally link it to tests. Probably also doesn't make sense. You can link it to user tests. Also doesn't make sense. Okay, this is going well. Cool. We have created a risk control called the content review process. That is good progress. Now, back to this risk table entry. Going here, edit. Okay, now we're here. Again, risk controls reducing this risk, and now we can select it. That's awesome. Okay, now we say, hey, we actually have a content review process. By the way, you can have multiple risk controls, which you add here. We only have one. And now the really cool thing is one of two things, or actually both things, can actually happen. You reduce the probability, or you reduce the severity, or both. Okay. What happens here? We have like bad medical content in the app, and we have a content review process. So in my opinion, this reduces the probability. Like, maybe we have crappy content, but it gets screened out by the content review process. So the probability that we have crappy content in the app later is basically zero, based on how good our process is. The severity, in my opinion, that doesn't change, because like, this is like, the scenario would be you have crappy content in the app, it makes it into the app in some way, and someone doesn't get this slight depression. They're just like a bit unhappy. Like, that doesn't make sense. Like, if the crappy content makes it to the app, the impact is the same. But we're reducing the probability of that happening. So we have something called a reduction factor. All of that is explained here. Let's say maybe it is super drastic. Like, maybe our process is so good that there's only a 0.1% chance, 10 to the power of minus of 3, of something making, or maybe there's a 1% chance of something making it past this process, right? Okay. What's the severity category after risk control? Only if changed. It is not changed. That's why we don't change it here. Okay. Save. Will this work? Let's take a look. Awesome. So firstly, we were successful. This risk is now acceptable based on our own criteria. Let's go through this, because this is a bit involved in my opinion. Okay, so before the risk control, we had this. This is unchanged initially. So you have the probability category of 1 because we have the probability of 0.1. We have the severity category of 2 because we have this minor damage. All of that is unchanged. That was the status quo before we added the risk control. But now all of this here is new. So we added a risk control, and we said, like, we have a content review process. What happens to the probability? We have a reduction factor of 100. That means 100 means we move this probability to the right side by 10 to the power of 2, right? Because it's 100. So oh yeah, oh man, I was correct, lucky. Okay, so you can see the probability now is no longer 0.1, it is 0.001, because we kind of like, yeah, we have 10 to the power of 2, and we kind of like use that to reduce this probability. Okay, if you don't understand the math, it's time to brush up on your math. Calculating probabilities. All right. Yes, so we changed the probability. The severity category was not changed, which makes sense, because like, if content makes it past this process, the impact is the same. Like, so that makes sense. So we have a new probability category. We're no longer in probability category 1, we're in category 2. Why are we in 2? Because now we have 0.001 instead of 0.1. If you head over to the risk matrix, you can see we were at 0.1. That put us in the middle of probability category 1, because it's in between 1.0 and 0.01. And now we had 0.001, which puts us actually in the middle of probability category 2. And the cool thing in Formwork, again, Formwork is awesome, is because is that it automatically does this lookup for you. It does like, hey, cool, you have this probability of 0.001. Oh, right, yeah, that's probability category 2, and that's cool. Imagine doing all of this in the spreadsheet. Like, yeah, good luck spending the rest of your life coding stuff in spreadsheets. That's what I did with the first 2 or 3 years of my professional life. It was not a great experience. Okay, and then now Formwork essentially says, hey, now we're in probability category 2, severity category 2, this is acceptable. Let's double check. We were here, probability category 1, severity category 2, this was not acceptable. Okay, that makes sense. What happened now is we moved from this cell to this cell, because again, the probability changed. We changed from 1 to 2. The severity category was unchanged, so we're staying in this column. Okay, so now we're no longer in this cell, we're in this cell, and this is green. So now the risk table entry is acceptable. Great success. And that's awesome. That's how risk controls work. It's literally nothing to add. If you've understood it so far, you've understood all there was to understand. Of course, like there might be other aspects to this, right? So what I just showed you here doesn't necessarily apply to all risk controls. So you can have like a risk control. Let's look at the form here. You could have a risk control, which is maybe training. Like you have a risk control where you train your users in a way. Like theoretically, you could kind of like have a mandatory app training for your app, and then in that training you inform users like, hey, all the content could be wrong, by the way, just so you know. So always be very careful when you read the content in our app. So this doesn't make a lot of sense, but training actually more often happens in kind of like a not really a B2B context, but when devices are being sold to physicians, for example. Like you have like a physician obviously should maybe undergo some training before they insert cardiac pacemakers. That, for example, makes a lot of sense. And then you have like information for safety, where you, for example, display information in the app, where you say like you have a pop-up, like, by the way, our content could be crappy. That would be information for safety. Protective measure is like something like, it's like what we just had could be protective measure or inherently safe design. Usually inherently safe design is like you build it in a way which makes this impossible, which is pretty rare, but also pretty solid, because inherently safe design usually makes the risk go away entirely. And something else to keep in mind is kind of like that it is also not generally the case that we always only reduce the probability. Like you have scenarios in which maybe the probability and the severity get reduced. Like for example, with cardiac pacemakers, for example, like if you only put a tiny battery in them, they can probably not electrocute a patient and kill them with electricity, but they can probably make your heart kind of like beat very irregularly. So I'm not really sure if that's the reason why they only have tiny batteries, but you get the idea. Like if you make certain changes to your devices, that might change the severity of the actual risk. So you have risk controls reducing the severity, which is also pretty cool. All right, so we talked about risk controls, and we actually looked at one risk control right now, and I think it was pretty successful, because now we can actually see, and all of this is linked again in Formwork, makes it really easy. You can see this risk table entry has now become acceptable because we added this risk control and because it reduced the probability. And that's how risk controls work. Now, a very common question generally is, do you always have to add risk controls? And in my opinion, that is not the case. So for example, with this entry at the bottom, entry number 2, like you have the app that crashes, it becomes unavailable, then the patient gets acute stress reaction, and we already deemed that to be acceptable. Now, the standards are kind of like vague, and auditors, they all have their own personal interpretation of things. The MDR, I think, also kind of like says you should reduce risk as far as possible. But again, everyone comes up with their own interpretation here. Personally, I would just say like, this is fine. Let's move on with our lives and let's actually continue shipping software. Some other weird auditors might say like, yeah, but you need to like reduce it as far as possible. And then you also need to add a risk control. I would say like, no, we already reduced it as far as possible. So long story short, don't add a ton of risk controls. Don't add like one risk control to every line here. Instead, like add them where the risks are not acceptable before risk controls, add them there, obviously. And so best case, your entire table looks green here. And a few hacks are also, I mean, you can reuse them too, right? Like you can reuse one risk control here. The risk control we introduced here, content review process, maybe that's something which can be used in other risk table entries too, to kind of like reduce the probability of other harms or hazardous situations and harms occurring and leading to a combination which is initially not acceptable, but now is acceptable. So that's cool. Your task is create some risk controls. But to be fair, I wouldn't just like kind of like go crazy and document all sorts of risk controls now, but instead create your risk table entries first, and then look at those which are not acceptable. Also kind of like review your risk matrix, whether this whole like colorful acceptability matrix like generally works for you, or maybe you might need to make some tweaks to that too. And then once you have that, you go back and look at the risks which were not acceptable here and introduce risk controls for them. And if like most companies, you've already been developing your device for like a couple of weeks or months or even years, then chances are you already have risk controls built somewhere in your software or hardware. You just need to like talk to your developers and find out what they are. So that's pretty cool. And as mentioned earlier, not all risk controls have to be in your device or in your software code. It can be like trainings. You can inform your users. It can be in your process in your company, like that you have certain procedures, like the content review procedure we just looked at. And it can be part of your development workflow too, like for example, having code review, doing extensive testing, all that sort of stuff. You can pretty much almost come up with whatever you want. So as long as you mostly keep it realistic. For example, it is usually not very realistic to say like, hey, it's in the user manual, when you know that for your device, for example, no one reads the user manual. So that's usually not that useful. But usually you still have lots of options which work really well. All right, good luck with your risk control. In the next few videos, or maybe only in the next video, we'll be wrapping up risk management, and hopefully we'll almost be done with this pretty soon.